Now allow me to welcome Dr. Robert Carter, visiting professor in Arabian and Middle Eastern archaeology, to talk to us about the history and archaeology of pearl fishing in Bahrain and the Gulf, 5500 BC to 1950 AD.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organisers for having me here. It's a great honour to be here to talk to so many people who are interested in pearls. I'm going to be talking about the history of pearl fishing and its impact, particularly on Bahrain and Maharak. I'm not going to be talking about its practice. That would be another lecture. I don't have time. I'm happy to do that in the future. Basically, Bahrain was the global centre of pearl production throughout most of recorded history. It produced a very significant proportion of the Gulf's pearls, which was the main supplier of pearls to the global markets. As we'll see, the history is actually extremely ancient, much older than people might realise. Let me see if I can make this work. So it's not the only place in the world that produces pearls. Here's a very simple map showing some of the locations. But one of the reasons that Bahrain's pearls and the Gulf's pearls were so important is because of the sheer volume and the quality that they were able to produce. It seemed almost impossible to exhaust the banks. There was a very significant fishery in India and Sri Lanka as well, but this was prone to collapse for years and sometimes decades at a time. Whereas in Bahrain and the Gulf pearl banks, the Hayat rather, there was going to be some kind of a harvest every single year, sometimes better than others. Oops, excuse me. Jump a huge number of slides forward. Not quite sure how I managed to do that. Well, there you go. We're doing the presentation in reverse at great speed. Unfortunately, I can't talk backwards. There you go. I think maybe we were working against each other then. There we go. Okay. So, the industry is more than 7,500 years old. The earliest pearls we find go back to around about 5,500 to 5,800 BC. In fact, most of the archaeological pearls that we've recovered from Eastern Arabia and the Gulf belong to this period. These were not accidental finds. People were deliberately pearl fishing the moment they were able to find pearls in this region. Before this time, the sea levels were lower, and in fact, I think you can safely say that the moment there was sea to fish pearls in, people were fishing pearls in the Gulf region. The ones we see here, there's a new one recently found. The one from Abu Dhabi, that should say 5,800 to 5,600 BC. That's the oldest one we have at the moment. It was excavated from a little village settlement or campsite on an island off Abu Dhabi. Previously, and this is the one that got me interested in pearls, this one here, for a while that was the oldest pearl that was found, which was excavated on a site in Kuwait that I was working on. And that site seems to have been involved in an early maritime trading network which connected Iraq with the Gulf region. And for those kind of reasons, I believe that pearls were actually an item of trade all the way back in the Stone Age. Here's an example of how they were worn by the locals. In this case, it's one on somebody's nose. So it's very old. This is an ancient industry. Now, I'm going to skip out the whole of the next 5,000 years, when we do get pearl finds, but they're quite isolated. It seems that after the Stone Age they became slightly less fashionable. They were definitely still collected, but they were no longer as important as they had been then. However, by the time we get to the Greeks and the Romans, pearls were very much in favour again. And in fact, the fisheries identified by the first Greeks who came into the Indian Ocean were immediately recognised and written about as something of wonder and something valuable and something of interest. Initially, they didn't make a distinction between the Indian fishery and the Gulf fishery, but by the time we get to the Romans, when we get to Pliny, he's actually able to name different places which were specifically associated with pearls. And one of them is Tylos, which is actually a name for Bahrain. Before his time, though, we hear of an island in the Persian Sea, and we think that probably refers to Bahrain. We find out that people went out every year, they dived down off raft and they collected pearls. And we have quite a lot of nice finds from around about this time. This is actually a painting from Egypt, which may have been using Gulf pearls, but of course it could have been from the Red Sea or even India. But these ones here, on your right-hand side, are from Eastern Arabia. We have some pearl jewellery from Bahrain, at Shahura, a cemetery, and some from Saudi Arabia. And we seem to have a general influx of wealth into Bahrain around this time. The burials that we get are often very rich in trade goods, in glassware from Rome, and in jewellery. So I think people were profiting very nicely out of the Roman trade. And in fact, the Romans complained about it. Not just Pliny, but other people were really unhappy that everyone was wearing pearls because it was a sign of wastefulness and luxury and effeminacy. Men were wearing pearls and they didn't like that at all. And here we have a quote. As they call them castanets, is if they even enjoyed the sound and the mere rattling together of the pearls. And nowadays, even the poor covet them. So clearly there was a big trade. People were able to afford to buy Gulf pearls. And here's some examples of some from Iraq of this particular kind of jewellery, crotalia. Now, I mentioned that he named Tylos. This is a quote from Pliny. Well, it's not a quote, but a reference from Pliny to Tylos with that a larger picture of the necklace from Bahrain I showed you earlier. And we also hear of a fishery in the lower Gulf. We actually do have evidence for pearl fishing at a site called Ad-Dur in the UAE, which includes a pearl diver's weight as well as a pile of oyster shells, which would have been collected for the mother of pearl rather than pearls themselves for this particular species. Now, after that, we have a little bit of a gap in the evidence. Pearl fishing continued. And then, by the time we get to the early Islamic period, it's very clear that pearling was again a major industry. We hear quite early accounts from the early Islamic historians and geographers about pearl fishing in the region. Before that, however, we learn about the Christian communities that pearl fished in the Gulf. Now, Bahrain was a centre of Christianity all the way up to the 8th century AD, so into the early Islamic period. And in fact, we believe that one of the sites named as a centre, which would have been a pearl fishing centre, Mashmahij, is actually the village of Samahij here on the island of Muharraq. We've never actually excavated there. But it's very clear from the records left by the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorian Church, that they were dealing with pearl fishers. They give instructions on how pearl fishers should be behaving. And in one case, this is just before the Islamic period, they were saying, look, you're not supposed to work on a Sunday, but if you have to do it, then you should. Just try not to be sinful at the same time. I'm not really sure what they mean. He says that you have to avoid sin and harmfulness. I mean, the translation, it's been through Syriac and French and then to English through me. So I'm doing the best I can. Anyway, we actually have quite good archaeological evidence for Christian communities all through the region at this time. And as I say, many of them, certainly the ones on the coast, would have relied on pearl fishing. And this craze in the West for pearls did continue into the late antique period. This is the famous mosaics from Ravenna of the Empress Theodora, the Byzantine empress, and here she is, completely festooned with enormous pearls. And they could have come from India and the Gulf, probably both, maybe the Red Sea. So, I mentioned the early Islamic sources. The best maghasats, that was the term they used then for the pearl beds, the hayrat. The best ones are found in the Persian Gulf, and the pearl banks of Bahrain are especially high quality. Okay, this was recognized very early on. There's a second best line of banks stretching out into the Gulf. Their pearls are known as Qatari. I have to be careful when I give this quote in Qatar. The Bahrainis have always claimed to have had the best pearls, and this is something which goes back more than 1,000 years. Europeans, again, knew about these pearl fisheries. I don't think we had such a trade that you'd seen in the Roman period, in the late antique period, but we have a very interesting atlas from the 14th century that shows the Gulf. Here. Iran. These guys are pearl fishing. You see? Here you go. Pearls of all colours. And the text is quite interesting. The text says that they're reciting. They need to hire sorcerers to recite spells to stop them from being attacked by sharks. And maybe they did. Other than that, we don't have a great deal of evidence from around about the 14th to the 17th century. But this is a very, very interesting and beautiful atlas. And at that time, there was no route through the Suez Canal, for example, and the Portuguese hadn't yet found out how to get around Africa. So the pearls had to go either up through Iraq and Syria into the Mediterranean, but actually most of them seem to have gone on a very roundabout route through Iran, overland, up to the Black Sea, and then round into the Mediterranean. And this was a trade dominated by Italian merchants, especially the Venetians and the Genoese. And the Venetians went from Hormuz, and the Genoese went from Fez, you can see there, and they followed slightly different routes around the Black Sea to take their pearls to the Western markets. And one day, someone really needs to get into the Venetian archives to see how this trade was managed at the Italian end. It's beyond me. I don't think my Italian would cope. And then moving on through time, Elizabeth, famously festooned with pearls. We have to be careful when we look at Queen Elizabeth of England's pearls, because firstly, some of them could be from Scotland. Others could be from the New World, because in the 16th century, the Spanish discovered the pearl beds of the New World, especially Venezuela. These were very quickly fished out. They never quite went away, but by this sort of the 1700s, they were almost completely destroyed. But for a while, there was pearls flooding into Europe from the New World. Here, though, we have another lovely picture of Bahrain from 1575. I'm not quite sure why these guys are not nets, but the captions describe it as a pearl fishing expedition. You can see baskets of pearls on that bit of Bahrain there. They seem to be boiling them in a pot there, which they actually never did in Bahrain, but they did do it in the Portuguese and Spanish possessions in the New World. So I think this guy Teve's got a bit mixed up. And then on the top, you see a little island. That's where we are now. Okay? You see the little house? Well, it's probably a church then, but let me have a look. It's not a church. The Portuguese had a small outpost on Muharraq. In fact, it was the Coast Guard station that we didn't visit on the Pearling Trail today. So they knew about the pearl trade, and they tried to tax it. They tried to tax it very heavily. And one of the reasons that they came to Bahrain and made it a priority during their conquest was because they'd heard about the wealth to be had from pearl fishing. And at the site of Talat al-Bahrain, which I don't know if you'll have time to visit, but it's on the main island, a very important archaeological site that goes from the Bronze Age all the way up to the Portuguese period, we found a nice little, well I didn't, but somebody found a nice little shell full of pearls. It's on display in the museum. So, the last part of my talk, I'll just talk about the impact in more recent centuries. By the time we get to the 18th, 19th and 20th century, it's really making a difference. The markets are so good that people are actually piling into the Gulf Coast and founding new settlements to fish for pearls. Muharraq would not exist if it wasn't for the pearl industry. Everybody in Muharraq relied on the pearl fishery. Everybody who wasn't a pearl fisher was a merchant or servicing the pearl fishery in some way. And this was noted by the British in very many publications throughout the 19th century. But here we have a quote from 1915, the early 20th century. Were the supply of pearls to fail, the trade of Kuwait would be severely crippled, while that of Bahrain would be, it is estimated, reduced to about 1/5 of its present dimensions, and so on and so forth. And in fact, this wasn't even the peak of the industry. His book was published in 1915, but he was using data that was gathered in about 1905. The peak was actually in 1912. And I mentioned that people were founding new settlements. This is the sum of, if you like, permanent settlement, the towns of the Gulf on the Arabian shore, all the way up to the 18th century. One in Ras Al Khaimah, known as Julfar, and there's always a town of sorts somewhere in Bahrain. And then by the time you get to the 18th and 19th century, you get all these popping up. These are here because people have come and settled on the coast from the inland areas, and from the Persian coast, and from Iraq, and from Oman. And they've settled there in order to make money from pearl fishing, because people are buying them all over the world. Oop, it happened again. Oh dear. How do I go back? Oh, this is how I go back. And actually, in the middle of this kind of period of explosive growth, the British start taking an interest in the Gulf, not because of the pearl fishery, but for other reasons. But because they needed to map the Gulf, because they wanted to have a strong military presence, we get our first maps and drawings of the Gulf towns. So here's Sharjah in 1820, Dubai in 1820. Oh, and Muharraq. There we go. No. Oh, I didn't do that. Okay. Good. It's gone mad.
She's changing it here, back here.
I think maybe if you let me try and get back to Muharraq. This. Yes.
Yeah.
Here, I'll ask you to change the slides because I think probably might think back down. There is Muharraq. Yeah, that's what we walked through. It had a wall in those days, and that little square below it, that's the Malha Fort that we weren't able to visit, but will be part of the pearling trade. Manama was not so much a pearl fishing town. It was a merchant town, and a lot of the pearl merchants were there, but it was more of a sort of sea trade and quality trade town. But Muharraq was the pearl fishery. Can we have the next one, please? And the point of this slide is that I want to show the growth. So there's a lot of historical data that I've looked at for various Gulf towns. Here's Doha, for example, in 1860 and 1908. You can see how it stretched along the seashore. This is Muharraq that grew from a core during the 19th century, particularly in the late 19th century. It's always expanding. And this is for economic reasons. It's again because there are more people there making money, the population is growing, people are doing quite well. And it's almost entirely composed of the pearl fisheries. And in fact, before Muharraq got very highly developed, a chap in the 1970s went and planned a lot of the traditional architecture was there. And he identified the growth ring quite close to where we are, in the souk area. And he put a date to them, and then we were able to refine that when we excavated in this warehouse, this linear warehouse, which is the Yusuf Abdurrahman Bahrain Amara, which some of us visited this morning. And I'll show you some more pictures of that. This was it in 1950, the warehouse. You see the quay at the front, and it stretches quite a long way. It looks foreshortened in this picture, but you can see it stretching off back into the inland. It is on reclaimed land. There was a process of land reclamation in the late 19th century. And this is what it looked like when we were sent in to excavate it in 2008. Unfortunately, this bit fell off while we were working there. But you can see the roots surviving in here. This was the office area. And then stretching off in the other direction were the date stalls and hardware shops that some of you would have seen earlier. And actually, we've got the ministry found the land deed for this, and we excavated and very carefully drew the plan of this whole building. And then later on, we were shown this thing, which showed pretty much exactly the same plan that we've got from archaeology. So I wouldn't call it a waste of time, because it was interesting. Sorry, can we just go back? And next door, we actually have a date. Ali, who was the brother of Yusuf Abdurrahman, kindly put a date here of 1932. So we knew at least when the one next door was built, which is actually after the collapse of the pearl fishery, which shows that, well, it was just when it was done. It shows that there was a little bit more to it at that time, because the oil industry was starting to pick up. Okay. And this was our plan. I don't know if you remember the date presses that you saw. They were in there, where the dates were left in the 1940s, when this end of the warehouse was closed down and eventually forgotten. And don't worry about that rather archaeological plan up there. It just shows that there were older buildings underneath and land reclamation events. Okay. Next one, please. Now, I'm just going to finish by talking a tiny bit about the material culture. People were making money and they were buying stuff. And what they started buying were commodities which actually were made in places like Holland, the UK and Japan. And this was a sign of wealth. This is starting to happen very noticeably in the archaeological record right at the end of the 19th century and in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. If we went and dug a hole here, we would get this stuff, yeah? Along with a lot of local earthenware as well. I've only picked out the important material here. You go anywhere in Bahrain, you can find all this European and Japanese pottery, which is people spending their money that they're getting from pearl fishing. They were doing very well. Next slide, please. And here's some more. And you know, we had that coffee break. These guys. This was the typical coffee cups around about 1905. You know, they've changed a little bit since, but the idea is still there. But before that time, they weren't here. Before the 1880s, the 1890s, you didn't get these coffee cups. You got a few, not very recognised, they couldn't keep up with the coffee cups. But the very distinctive Arabian coffee cups really only occurred at the time. And they're probably from Japan. Whereas pretty much everything else is from Europe. And as I said, it's all about money. So one of the holes that we dug around about the warehouse, close to the warehouse, produced a nice cache of 100 rupees, which is a good wage. It's what a poor pearl diver, maybe at the height of the industry, he would expect to make about twice that in a year. So it's a poor pearl diver's half yearly wages. For a merchant, a rich merchant, it's not so much. But it's still 100 silver rupees. And the dates, 1852 to 1912, most of them were actually 1880s onwards, kind of reflects the peak of the industry. Someone had buried these or buried them in his floor or something to keep it safe, and he obviously never told anyone. And when he died, it stayed there. And actually, I think some of them are on display in one of the displays on the Bahrain Pearl Show. So it's all about money. Next slide, please. And this is it. I spent years compiling statistics in the British administration report of the value of the pearl fishery. This is Bahrain valued in 1770. Can be further that way. I've got my point. Peaking between 1880 and 1920. You can see that huge spike. That's because of price rises in the West. This was a market-driven economy, and it responded to markets. So every year for a while, the prices were doubling. They were trying to get more and more pearls out of the sea. In fact, they probably weren't getting much more. They found they couldn't get much more than they were already getting, but the prices continued to rise. Then there was a massive correction at the start of the First World War. Then they started recovering again. Then you get the Great Depression, and then you get the cultured pearl turning up. And the cultured pearl meant that the value of all pearls dropped to less than a tenth of what it would have been. So it never corrected after 1930. It went back down to very, very low levels. And in fact, the only people who fished for pearls between 1930 and 1950 were those who couldn't get any other kind of employment and were actually starving. You made very little money out of it in the last couple of decades. And from the 1930s onwards, people were getting oil revenues as well. So the industry withered away because people, thankfully, found another source of income. I'm not going to really bother much with this slide. It sums up what I said, that pearl fishing really had a formative influence on the Gulf. Most of these towns would not exist without pearl fishing. And it also drew the people of the Gulf into a much more global market economy, which they'd only been tangentially linked to before. And last one, I think. Thank you very much for listening.